BBOR Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia at heart and from around the globe. And hello, everybody. Today is Wednesday, another Ripper Wednesday. Welcome to the show. How's everybody doing? On Wednesdays, I do a segment about Jack the Ripper, perhaps the world's most famous unsolved mystery. And you guys know the drill. You can hit the like button if you want, subscribe if you haven't, and drop a comment down below if you have something to say about Jack the Ripper. For larger things, you can send them to me at blackboxonlineradio@aol.com. And I am your host, Blackbox Ned. Jack the Ripper was a serial killer that operated in England in 1888, and whatever happened before or after that is still part of the mystery. And it has now been 2 years since I've been doing the Ripper Wednesday segment, and that shocks me. It feels like it was 3 or 4 months ago when this program started, and there's something even bigger than that. It's been 136 years since Jack the Ripper's crime spree, and still to this day nobody knows the identity of Jack the Ripper. And not only that, there are so many other unanswered questions in the Ripper case. It truly is something that captivates people for many different reasons. In 2023, I started something called the Jack the Ripper Report, which wasn't intended to be a formal news report. It just gets that name because many different Jack the Ripper related subjects were discussed within a single episode. And as you see from the title of this show, this is now the month of January for 2025, so I thought the start of the year could have a 1 week only return to the Jack the Ripper Report, and I wanted to talk about not only things that I have found online and ideas that I've been thinking about with the Ripper case, but I also wanted to look at some of your questions and comments that were left on previous Ripper Wednesdays, as well as just talking about some things that have come to mind, and also talking about the experiences that we had together on previous Ripper Wednesday episodes, which came out in 2024. Firstly, I would like to give a big thank you to everyone who listened to last week's Ripper Wednesday episode, which was talking all about the DNA evidence, and the book Naming Jack the Ripper by Russell Edwards, which claims that there is a DNA link between the semen stain that's found on a shawl that was in the possession of one of the Ripper's victims, allegedly and reportedly, and a Jack the Ripper suspect named Erid Cosensi. It was an episode that I had wanted to do for quite some time, and if you haven't heard that yet, it's called Jack the Ripper, the DNA Evidence Full Analysis. And a lot of you guys left some very insightful comments, which I would like to use to start the Jack the Ripper report today. And the first one comes to us from Just Tango, who says, every give or take 2 years, in the United Kingdom, there will be a sensationalized story in the news about how the over 100-year-old case of Jack the Ripper has finally been solved. At the very end of the news article, you'll realize the whole thing is just a plug for some author's new book coming out, and said author will not have any evidence at all for whomever their suspect is. And this is one that I agree with about 50%. I can agree with this comment halfway. And I say that because over the last 2 years on Ripper Wednesday, particularly in the last 12 months, I've encountered a lot of different theorists. I've encountered a lot of different perspectives on the Ripper case, and I can see that some people seem to have evidence and other people do not. And to be clear, this is evidence, not proof, to stay true to the terms. For example, I think that one of the Jack the Ripper suspects that I'm going to have to revisit in the future is Chaim Hyams, and I think he's a reasonable or mid-level Jack the Ripper suspect. I first talked about him on the channel back in 2023, but it wasn't until 2024 that I did a standalone episode about Chaim Hyams, which you can hear on BBOR. But there's a book that was written about him called One-Armed Jack by Sarah Bax Horton. And if you're going to talk about evidence, she has done the work. I would give her credit. This would be the 50% where I am disagreeing with this comment. This isn't just somebody plugging a book that is full of wacky ideas or someone who doesn't have evidence. There was painstaking research that went into her book, One Armed Jack. For example, she went through asylum records, and then she found out about Chaim Chaim's, and then she went through local records and found out that there were actually 4 people with his name, and she had to use clues to track down the person who was actually ending up in the asylum, learning things about his behaviors, learning things about his lifestyle. And I mean, she has done the hard work. And I do give credit to people who are doing the hard work, because so many people get accused of just pushing a book and then they're trying to make money, or they are trying to make money because of wild ideas and wild accusations that are contained in the book. But something like that does appear to have hard work as well as research and evidence, but maybe not proof. And she's built a really interesting case around her Jack the Ripper suspect, Chaim Chaim's, but hence the name of the book, One Armed Jack. There are some doubts that I have. Chaim Chaim's had an arm injury in February of 1888, several months before the Whitechapel murders, and definitely before Jack the Ripper's Autumn of Terror crime spree, going from August 31st to November 9th of 1888. And I often listen back to old episodes of Black Box Online Radio, and I was just listening to the one that I did called Jack the Ripper Suspect Chaim Chaim's, which again needs a much larger presentation because he is a Jack the Ripper suspect that I think is worth exploring. This is something that is just bothering me over and over again. He did not appear to have complete use of both of his arms. That's why it's called One Armed Jack. It appears that after the arm injury in February of 1888, he would have had almost complete dysfunction of the arm, for lack of a better term. He would not have been able to use one of his arms, but by the Autumn of Terror, he would have just had arm stiffness. Even that, though, I mean, when I'm reading about Jack the Ripper suspects, most of them seem like they're in their 20s or 30s. Sometimes you will encounter older Jack the Ripper suspects, but we can talk about them at the end of this episode. So I have some doubts about Chaim Chaim's, but this comment specifically was about the reasons why people push books and the reasons why they are doing their quote-unquote investigations, and also stating that some people don't have evidence. Now, with Russell Edwards, the one that I was discussing last week, by the one, I mean the book that I was discussing last week by Russell Edwards called Naming Jack the Ripper, I'm really a little bit uncertain about his motivations. And because this is a Jack the Ripper report where we can talk about many different subjects, I can also just share what I think very freely. I was reading the early sections of his book Naming Jack the Ripper, and I'm quite curious if he wanted to do this for profit. He was planning on spending over £150,000 on a piece of fabric, a shawl that was allegedly and reportedly owned by Catherine Eddowes, the 4th victim of Jack the Ripper, to see if it had DNA evidence that could be connected to a Jack the Ripper suspect. And this was a giant process that was done first by linking the DNA to a descendant of Catherine Eddowes, which they claimed they were able to do with a 100% match, stating that it was indeed her shawl and it was indeed her blood that was on the shawl or this piece of fabric. And then also the question that people really wanted to know the answer to was, well, what about the suspect in question, Erid Cosensi, the Polish barber, the 23-year-old man with some serious mental health issues who was living in Whitechapel at the time, who goes into the asylum in 1891. Well, is that credible evidence or not? And just when I was reading these stories, not specifically about the DNA evidence, but just about how much Russell Edwards was invested in purchasing the shawl, and what were his plans, like what were his ideas after he was going to make this type of breakthrough. I mean, I would expect that everybody who follows the Jack the Ripper case wants to know the truth. Everybody wants to know who Jack the Ripper was. Some people believe that they have, and they might not accept the contradictory evidence, but, I mean, I don't necessarily think that he did it purely for profit, but I wonder how much of it was invested in, okay, I'm going to go through this process so I can write this book, get some type of multi-million-pound book deal. And I don't even know if any of those things happened, but what I do know for certain is that Russell Edwards received international exposure back in 2014 when naming Jack the Ripper was coming out, this story was going to all corners of the globe about some type of DNA breakthrough in the Jack the Ripper case. Now, there's a Jack the Ripper suspect that I haven't talked about too frequently on the channel, and his name is Michael Maybrick. He's the brother of another Jack the Ripper suspect named James Maybrick. And again, I'm only sharing what I think. You can challenge me in the comments section down below. And Michael Maybrick ended up becoming the suspect of an individual named Bruce Robinson, who wrote the book They All Love Jack, and the full title is They All Love Jack Busting the Ripper. And Bruce Robinson is someone whom I would place way higher on the fraudulent radar. And I don't know what was in his mind. I don't know what was in his heart. I don't know what his intentions were when he was writing the book 100%. I'm not a psychic, but at the same time, the way that his narrative was composed was, firstly, he took the brother of another established Jack the Ripper suspect, Michael Maybrick, again, the brother of James Maybrick, and then he blended in a lot of the Masonic theories that are expressed by Stephen Knight in The Final Solution. And it's these two Jack the Ripper theories that go together, but I was really just wondering, like, how much of this did he actually believe? Because when he does presentations promoting his own book, he openly says that he began investigating the Ripper case because someone said they thought it would be a good idea for a story in a book, and it would be a good thing to investigate because it's the mother of all cases, it's the mother of all true crime stories, and in many ways, it's the mother of all stories, period. But some people point out that I've made other comments about the Masonic connection to the Jack the Ripper case on previous Ripper Wednesday episodes, saying that at first I thought that this Masonic connection about how there are clues connected to the Masons and the orders of the Masons in the Jack the Ripper case were nonsensical. I thought that in the past, but I had a reversal on it and thinking, okay, there might actually be some credibility to this. Yeah, I do stand by that. And I do not know 100%, what Bruce Robinson was thinking. And maybe he just encountered some of the evidence in the same way that I did. Or maybe he wanted to blend some stories together because he thought that it would make for a good idea for a book. And that's perhaps what Just Tango was talking about. And we have a comment here from James Corlett, also on last week's episode, that is discussing something that is related to a popular Jack the Ripper channel called House of Lechmere, which is hosted by Edward Stowe. And it's called House of Lechmere because Edward Stowe's Jack the Ripper suspect is Charles Lechmere. He was a witness who found the body of Polly Nichols on August 31st of 1888, the first witness to find her body. And Edward Stowe believes that Lechmere was not only Jack the Ripper, but he would go on to commit other crimes perhaps. And it's really Krister Holmgren who is perhaps the loudest voice saying that Lechmere was both Jack the Ripper and the Thames Torso killer. But as far as this claim that Lechmere was Jack the Ripper, and James Corlett says, Ed Stowe, this should be a quotation, if it ain't Lech, it ain't Ripper. And somebody responded to that by calling him a troll. And in the defense of James Corlett, who wrote out this comment, I don't think that's a trolling comment. I think that that's the defense that a lot of people have. Like, why do they disagree with certain suspects? Because they have their own Jack the Ripper suspect. And the other stories that I talk about here on Black Box Online Radio are the Zodiac Killer and D.B. Cooper, Unsolved Mysteries. And I was just reading this in a true crime group on Facebook about how someone was saying that they disagree with someone's suspect. And the other person's like, well, why do you disagree with my suspect? And that person said, well, I have my own suspect. I've conducted my own investigation, and this is my person of interest. Okay, so, I mean, that's the reason why. And for a short time, I should say, I hosted a program called the Zodiac Killer Channel's Interview with the Expert series. And one of the people whom I had the opportunity to interview was Mark Hewitt, who is the author of Hunted, Profiled, and Exposed, and, I should also point out, Obsessed. And I asked him this question because comes up a lot, and the question is that if you are going to have your own suspect in an unsolved mystery, should you be able to talk about other people's suspects? Should you be able to provide the reasons why you think that that person's suspect was not Jack the Ripper? And he flat out said, no, I don't agree with that at all. And we're talking about the Zodiac Killer, actually. Should you provide the reasons why that person's suspect was not the Zodiac or Jack the Ripper or D.B. Cooper. And he said, I don't agree with that at all. The reason why is because that person has their own suspect. And I believe that the reason why James Corlett wrote this out in the comment section was he was stating that Edward Stowe was being overly dismissive of other people's claims, overly dismissive of other people's evidence. And as we've already said, this is evidence, this is not proof. No matter what, though, I congratulate Edward Stowe on the success that he's had with his channel. Some of his videos have become very popular. I think that he narrates them in a very interesting way and in a very engaging way, and he's sharing a lot of stories of his own personal experiences. So I definitely appreciate it when somebody is just making some very interesting Jack the Ripper content. And the next comment comes to us from Karen D, who says, what if the shawl or table runner that was mentioned in the book naming Jack the Ripper came from Erid Cosensi's home? He came from a Jewish background, and on this piece of silk was embroidered Michaelmas daisies connected with their religion. There is no way Catherine Eddowes could afford a silk shawl, so that is to assume that it was brought to the scene by Erid Cosensi. Well, I mean, you've made an enormous amount of assumptions there in that comment. Firstly, that, okay, let's say there is Catherine Eddowes' blood on this piece of fabric, whether it's a table runner. I keep calling it fabric. That might not even be the best term, but whether it's a table runner or the shawl, it seems like it came into contact with Catherine Eddowes at some point. And that's something that I'm not even disputing. Number one, did it come from Cosensi's home? Well, why would he be bringing that to a Jack the Ripper crime scene? Would it be to conceal the knife? Is he wrapping up the knife? I mean, there'd be so many easier options for him to use. How about something called a pocket? How about something called an overcoat or a cloak? Something to that effect. And also, why would he so carelessly leave that at the scene? Was he dropping it to write the Goulston Street graffito? And the next point is that you would perhaps have a case for that if somehow you could prove that the cloth came from Erid Cosensi's home. But that's just on the same page with proving that Erid Cosensi was Jack the Ripper. And I'm not saying that you're wrong. I don't know who was in possession of that, but I will provide an additional possibility about how you think that Catherine Eddowes could not have afforded that. Perhaps somebody gave it to her. I mean, that would be a way where she would be able to obtain it without paying for it. So as we see that these are possibilities that are put on the table, as opposed to things where we can truly put it under the microscope and say with a certifiable fact that, yes, this is what happened. And if we are going to talk about Erid Cosensi as a Jack the Ripper suspect, we have one from Propaganda DATWO. I'm guessing that's Propaganda Datwo, who says, but he probably did it. Oh, I don't dispute that at all. Like, I said this in my suspect ratings episode, that I think that Erid Cosensi is a strong Jack the Ripper suspect. But guess what? If it turns out that some way, somehow, Erid Cosensi was Jack the Ripper, that stain on the table runner or the shawl might not even have come from him. I mean, tens of thousands of people, maybe hundreds of thousands of people could have had the same mitochondrial DNA that was connected to that person. That's bigger than the population of Whitechapel. So, I mean, just because there is that type of link, that doesn't mean that it was Cosensi's. And even if some way, somehow, using a different method, we were able to prove that Erid Cosensi was Jack the Ripper, I would still question that DNA evidence and say, well, wait a second, how do we truly know that was his? I mean, that's DNA from a semen stain, and it doesn't appear that semen stains were left behind at all of the Ripper's crime scenes, definitely not at the murder of Liz Stride. So there are lots of reasons to doubt that that is Cosensi's DNA. Or at the very least, if we were able to prove some way, somehow, that Erid Cosensi was Jack the Ripper, I would just say that that shawl is an unnecessary entry into the evidence book. It's part of the story, sure, but there are so many clouds and so many murky waters that are just in and around that DNA evidence. But yes, Cosensi could have been Jack the Ripper. And unlike the other cases that I follow, I mean, this is one where I really do have suspects. And I'm only thinking about the Zodiac killer mystery. I could talk to you about D.B. Cooper suspects. I could talk to you about theories in the JonBenet Ramsey case. And in the month of March for this year, I'm going to be launching a new series about the story of JonBenet Ramsey here on Black Box Online Radio. And I invite you to check that out. And if you're listening to this at a future date, please feel free to visit some of the content about JonBenet Ramsey here on BBOR. And as far as Jack the Ripper suspects go, I think that some of the top ones should be Erid Cosensi, Jacob Levy, and I have this type of wavering effect on Francis Thompson as a Jack the Ripper suspect. Most of what he says is, most of what I say about him is connected to the psychological profiling aspects. And sometimes I say he's a top tier suspect. Sometimes I say he's a mid tier suspect. He goes up and down. But there's also a Chaim Hyams who I'm very curious about. And I've said on previous Ripper Wednesday episodes that George Hutchinson is rising in my book about being a solid Jack the Ripper suspect. And I can also share something in a personal way, on a personal note. And there was somebody who was writing out things in the comment section here on Black Box Online Radio saying that George Hutchinson was their Jack the Ripper suspect. And they were saying it in somewhat of a rude and confrontational way. But the reasons why they thought that George Hutchinson was Jack the Ripper were not truly expressed, other than they were just criminological. It's the study of this type of crime. It's the study of crime that needs to be analyzed. And the more that I actually study criminology, George Hutchinson looks like a stronger suspect. I have some doubts about that. And my honest doubts about him as a Jack the Ripper suspect is that he is a witness who goes on to become a suspect, much like Charles Lechmere, much like other witnesses such as Isaac Kosabrodsky and Louis Diemschutz and Samuel Friedman. Witnesses go on to become suspects, but there is this very odd insertion of George Hutchinson into the story on November 9th of 1888 with the murder of Mary Kelly. So I think that, I won't hear more about that, but a big reversal that I had with Jack the Ripper suspects comes from my looking into Joseph Barnett as a Jack the Ripper suspect. Joseph Barnett was the ex-boyfriend of Mary Kelly, the final victim, and on my suspect ratings episode, I put him as a top-tier suspect. Now, I think he drops to mid-tier because I just think that the physical evidence is not necessarily there, and I also think that a lot of this is based on psychological profiling, but perhaps not the strongest reasons of that psychological profiling. And I've said this on previous Ripper Wednesday episodes, so I'll be brief. I mean, Joseph Barnett is the person who identified the body of Mary Kelly, and I just don't think that he could have put on a professional acting job and not been completely horrified and then fooled all the officers if he were not some type of classically trained actor about everything. But perhaps, sociopaths and psychopaths can put on strong acting performances. But if we're going to talk about the suspects, there is one that I truly need to revisit, and his name is David Cohen, and he is the suspect of Martin Fido. And I said at the beginning of Ripper Wednesday 2 years ago that I really wanted to read Martin Fido's book. I listened to his program Murder After Midnight, which one of you guys sent me to blackboxonlineradio at AOL.com. But my episode on David Cohen as a Jack the Ripper suspect did not hold a candle to the substance material. And that is one that truly needs a reworking and a refurbishing, if you will, and a reinvention, if you will, to just give the material an honest and fair shake. Because, a lot of you guys are very curious about David Cohen as a Jack the Ripper suspect. David Cohen was not his real name. He was a Polish Jew who was also known as Nathan Kaminsky, but that most likely was not his real name either. And I just openly apologize to you guys in the Black Box Online Radio audience for all the mistakes that I made in the David Cohen episode and all the errors that I made along the way. and just not being very thorough. And if there is another Jack the Ripper suspect that I would want to revisit, it would also be Frederick Bailey Deeming, who was an Australian Jack the Ripper suspect. Sometimes he's referred to as Australia's Jack the Ripper, and in all seriousness, he is a very global Jack the Ripper suspect. It's just my episode on him, which came out in 2024, was not very thorough either. Here's the problem. David Cohen is a suspect that I really want to know more about because there could be something there. He's not a high level suspect or a low level suspect. He is a question mark suspect, in my opinion. I need to reanalyze the facts. Frederick Bailey Deeming, he is a low ranking Jack the Ripper suspect in my family. He murdered his. In my family. I got ahead of myself. In my book, he murdered his family in Australia. I'm not related to him to the best of my knowledge, not related to Australia's Jack the Ripper, but yes, I mean, he is a low-ranking Jack the Ripper suspect. I don't think he did it. It's just, if I want to give the material a fair shake, I would investigate that. And the same would be true with Severin Klasovsky, who also used the name George Chapman. He is a question mark suspect, in my opinion. Let's see what's there. Let's see what we can find. And I also want to point out that in the last 12 months, there was a viral set of videos that were going around from someone who claimed that the French painter Edgar Degas was Jack the Ripper. And she was making this case that Edgar Degas was somebody who had this type of bizarre fascination with women in a very destructive and sadistic way, quite similar to the way that Patricia Cornwell accused Walter Sickert, a painter, of being Jack the Ripper. But one of the things that was so odd about this presentation was it was so clearly stated that Edgar Degas was not even living in England at the time, and like the person who was making those videos was just saying, well, it's a short trip from France to England, and I was not impressed at all. And here's something different. Here's something different about that type of presentation. That is not so much, well, is this person fraudulent or not? Is this person telling the truth or not? Oh, I believe that she was telling the truth. I don't know her name, but the person who made those videos accusing Edgar Degas of being Jack the Ripper, I think she believed everything that she was saying. But I think she did so for a very different reason. If I can be honest with you guys, I think that was just a game. I think that was just somebody pulling out a historical figure and saying, let's see if I can make this person fit in the Jack the Ripper narrative. And yes, they believed all the connections that they had. They believed all the explanations. And at first it starts out as, well, I think it might be possible. Let's see if I can find some other connections. And then they just start doing their own mental gymnastics, and it all compounds upon itself. It just builds this giant mound of circumstantial evidence, which is all very flimsy evidence. Well, Edgar Degas used to go to England a lot to have lunch with, somebody, some other famous individual. I don't even remember. It was one of the famous writers or something like that. And he also would just get back on the train and then go back to France. And then I would just sort of like, that's it, that's your explanation. Well, he liked to do short day trips to England, therefore he was Jack the Ripper. Not convincing at all. Not convincing at all. But I do think that person believed everything they were saying, but it's all just arranged in some type of role-playing game where it's like, let's just evaluate the facts and see if I can find exactly what I'm looking for. Let's just see if I can find all the diamonds in the rough and put them together. But you haven't decided what the diamonds are. You're just pulling up random rocks and be like, well, this is close enough to a diamond, and this one's close enough to a diamond. You know what? I think I've solved the Jack the Ripper case, and I think Jack the Ripper was the French painter Edgar Degas. And that's it. End of story. But I would love to know what you think about any of the Jack the Ripper suspects that I've talked about in this episode. I would love to know what you think about any of the issues that I've said, and I would love to know what you think about any books that might be discussed here on the channel. And there's also going to be an announcement that if you've listened to this program up to this point, perhaps you are very curious about the Jack the Ripper case. I talk about the Zodiac Killer and D.B. Cooper and John Benet Ramsey here on this channel, so some people who are listening mostly follow other stories and then they just tune in for a little bit of Jack the Ripper just to see what's going on. But if you've made it to the end of this Jack the Ripper report, you are probably heavily invested in the world of Ripperology. And there's going to be more Jack the Ripper content. There are going to be bigger Jack the Ripper episodes. And one of the reasons is that compared to the other stories that I've mentioned, the Zodiac Killer D.B. Cooper and Jean Benet Ramsey, the Ripper case is so much older. And because it is older, more works of literature have been written about the Ripper. And I'm saying literature because some of them are true crime, some are fictional stories. There are so many movies about the Ripper. And a lot of that stuff is going to be discussed here on Ripper Wednesday. And the Jack the Ripper report is not going to be around forever. This is a one-shot episode, if I'm using the term correctly, a one-day-only episode. But yes, the show might come back. I did a Jack the Ripper report episode about 6 or 7 months ago, and it's just an opportunity to talk about many different subjects under the umbrella of Jack the Ripper. But I am also a little bit disappointed in myself. I started the Ripper report way too early. I was doing Ripper Wednesday for about 5 or 6 months before I launched the Jack the Ripper report, and I was such a newcomer to the case that I don't think that I did it justice. And I didn't start the Zodiac Killer news report, which comes out on Mondays, until about 6 or 7 years into my world into the Zodiac case. Not only, well, let's see, be honest, not only 1 year. So maybe this program will take a larger shape in the future. But for now, I'm going to be focusing Ripper Wednesday on more subject-based materials, because that's how I approach the other stories here on Black Box Online Radio, specifically the Zodiac Killer case. First, I began with the suspect profiles. Then it turned into the other theories that people have. Just, this is my theory connecting, the perpetrator to other unsolved mysteries. Maybe this person was a possible victim. Then it went to the books. And then it just turned into, we have all of these different episodes and all these bases have been covered. Let's look at the comparisons among them and discuss them within a single episode. And that's how the Zodiac Killer news report was created. Perhaps the Jack the Ripper report will come back, but I definitely started it a little prematurely. And I used to conclude all the Jack the Ripper reports in the past with a poem, because there are Jack the Ripper suspects who are famous poets. I already mentioned Francis Thompson. And if we're going to talk about Edgar Degas being Jack the Ripper, he was a man who was actually in his 50s. But there's another poet who was in his 50s, much older than Francis Thompson. He is a more widely discussed Jack the Ripper suspect, and his name is Lewis Carroll. And that may have been one of the most fascinating episodes that I made in 2024, the one on Lewis Carroll, Jack the Ripper suspect Lewis Carroll, because it's one that is discussing a widely distributed Jack the Ripper suspect, but it was a lot of it was debunking the evidence that had been brought forward. And I think the only appropriate poem to read for the conclusion of this Jack the Ripper report is Jabberwocky by Lewis Carroll. And Lewis Carroll was birth name was Charles Ludwig Dodgson. So that's what is credited here for the poem. Jabberwocky. 'Twas brillig and the slivy toes did gyre and gimble in the wabe. All mimsy were the borogoves, and the mome rafts outgrabe. Beware the Jabberwock, my son, the jaws that bite and the claws that catch. Beware the Jubjub bird and shun, the frumious bandersnatch. He took his vorpal sword in hand, long time the max-known foe he sought. So he rested by the tum-tum tree, and stood a while in thought. And as if an uffish thought he stood, the Jabberwock with eyes of flame came whiffling through the Tudley wood, and burbled as it came. 1, 2, 1, 2, and through, and through. The vorpal blade went snicker-snack. He left it dead, and with its head he went gallumping back. And hast thou slain the Jabberwock? Come to my arms, my beamish boy. O frabjous day, Callooh Calais, he chortled in his joy. 'Twas brillig in the slithy toves, did gyre and gimble in the wabe. All mimsy wore the borogoves, and all the mome wraths outgrabe. And one of the reasons why I said this was perhaps not my favorite, but close to my favorite episode on Ripper Wednesday was the world of Lewis Carroll is so fascinating outside of the Jack the Ripper case. I even played a clip from an episode of a channel that's called Girl in the Blue Dress when she talks about how Lewis Carroll seems like he's writing in gibberish, like those words was brillig in the slithy toves. They don't necessarily have English language meanings. And some people thought that Lewis Carroll was simply trying to use sounds that would evoke emotions in people. It sounds like something where you could figure out what it is based on the context purely because you associate those sounds with certain mental images. But in the presentation from Girl in the Blue Dress, she was talking about how there is something that is so much more complex than that. If Lewis Carroll did indeed have autism, one of the things he may have been doing is he was taking these nonsensical words, but he was arranging them in logical sequences where everything is actually lining up in a specific order, and it's not just pulling out words that are silly sounding or words that are rough sounding, that there actually is something happening where it is this type of mental organization on a very, very profound level. And I perhaps could talk about this for another 36 minutes, but I think you can get the basic idea of that. And I would just like to thank everybody for listening to the Jack the Ripper Report. And I know that a lot of you are more focused on the evidence, more focused on the suspects. You don't necessarily want to hear too much about poetry. That's why I save it for the end. But there are going to be new things coming out about Jack the Ripper every Wednesday. And there is also going to be something called the Double Event. And that was started on this channel, again, by chance actually. I first read a book review of Robert Graysmith's The Bell Tower, and that's talking about his Jack the Ripper suspect, John George Gibson, as well as the accomplice, Jesse Gibson. And I did 2 Jack the Ripper episodes on Wednesday, and it was purely just by chance. I was like, oh, I found this book review, and I wanted to enter it as a resource on YouTube. I didn't monetize it or anything. I just read it off, but it was only 9 minutes long, and I'm like, this isn't enough for a Ripper Wednesday. So that's how the double event was formed, and there will be some reemergences of that coming later this year. And I've also discussed Ripper by Dean B. Cloud on the double event. Lots of Jack the Ripper content available here on this channel, and thank you so much for listening to Black Box Online Radio and Ripper Wednesday. There's a lot to look out for here on this channel. Please drop any ideas you have for future Jack the Ripper episodes in the comments section down below. And I'm your host, Black Box Ned. That will be all for me now. Until next time.